before we dive in and begin with our panels for the day, we are incredibly lucky to have the opportunity for some opening remarks with Loyola Law's very own Dean LeCesne. Dean LeCesne is Loyola's Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the advisor for the Black Law Students Association, and is a winner of the favorite and most trusted professor awards from the Student Bar Association. So Dean LeCesne, I now pass the e-mic over to you.
Thank you, Jillian, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to Loyola University College of Law Symposium on Structural Racism and the Law. I want to start by, first of all, thanking all of the folks who were instrumental in putting this first of its kind symposium together. First of its kind in the sense that it is a collaborative effort between the Law Review staff, the Black Law Students Association, and the Journal of Public Interest Law. And the first person I want to thank is Professor Sokol, Professor Karen Sokol, the Law Review faculty advisor, because it was her idea that inspired this symposium. It was her idea to get students from these organizations to work together to put on this very timely and compelling symposium on racism, structural racism, and the legal remedies to address it. So I want to thank her for that. When she first floated this idea back in at the beginning of the school year, our students ran with it. This idea ignited a passionate and inspired response from the leadership of those student organizations, and it culminated in this remarkable event we have today with these fantastic speakers that include scholars, practitioners, and activists who are going to speak on some exciting, timely topics that carry with it special urgency. So again, I want to thank the hard work or the staffs for all the hard work that they put into making this happen. I also want to give some special thanks to three individuals who were particularly instrumental in putting this together. And they are Melia Serrato, who is the Loyola Law Review Symposium editor, Michaela Graves, who is president of the Loyola chapter of the Black Law Student Association, and Jillian Morrison, who is the Journal of Public Interest Law Symposium editor. So thank you for all of your hard work. So, structural racism in the law, the theme of this symposium, could not be more timely. We are at yet another moment in our history when racism is resurgent and openly embraced by the very highest levels of government and industry. And I say yet another moment because we have been here before. Indeed, race and racism are central to the origins of our country. And the systemic racial inequities that followed have been with us ever since, manifested in grossly disparate access to quality healthcare, education, employment, housing, and the unequal dispensation of criminal justice. Yet, as a country, we have been in denial that these race-based inequities even exist. But recent events, and particularly the last 4 years, have laid bare the sad and ugly truth. Events like the recurrent racially motivated murders of people of color by law enforcement and even ordinary white citizens, I'm sorry.
Professor LeCesne, I think you're muted again. Hold on one second. Let's see.
Okay, can you tell me where I left off? Well, I'll just pick up where I think I began to be muted. I don't know if it's something that I hit or if it's something that is happening beyond my movements. But what I was saying is that recent events have exposed what we've known all along with respect to the existence of structural racism. And among those events include the adoption of white supremacy as a mainstream political ideology, policy, and even an electoral strategy. The legislative disenfranchisement of Black voters, soon to be sanctioned by the United States Supreme Court. A pandemic which exposed these long-standing structural inequities with fatal clarity and consequence. And a violent insurrection by white hate groups seeking to overturn a presidential election because they believe the votes in predominantly Black cities should not have been counted. My point in mentioning these events is that racism, structural or otherwise, is no longer veiled, nuanced, implicit, or unconscious. It is expressed, it is intentional, and it is unequivocally undeniable. And I think that's an important context to consider for discussions like the ones we are about to have. If there's any good that comes from the stark corroboration of racism that these recent events provide, it is the opportunity to now confront and address structural racism unimpeded by the voices of denial. So we can now have more solution-driven discussions like the ones today. And we can refocus our energies on legal and policy remedies without the dilatory effect of having to justify their need. So as they say, it's now game on. And with that, let's begin with our first panel, which I'll turn over to Professor Mitch Crusto to moderate. Professor Crusto.
Thank you very much, Dean LeCesne, and for your wonderful introduction to this very beautiful day of conversation on a very important topic, a very timely topic. I want to share your thanks to the various members of the different student organizations for all of their hard work in putting together this very important program symposium today. Professor Soko as well for coming up with the idea and leading, and the faculty and the staff in supporting this. And most importantly, our beautiful speakers who are here with us today, who are giving up their personal time. Lots of them who have faced, freezing temperatures and broken water pipes and all kind of things going on out there. Some of them are my old friends, some of them are my new friends. I'm looking forward to hearing their comments today. And also the beautiful attendees of Goodwill who are here to participate in today's program. The format for today is that we're going to basically do a brief introduction of the speakers. Their bios are already included in the program, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on bios, and I apologize because if we did so, they are so well accomplished that we would spend the entire day just reading their qualifications. So we're going to make presentations. They will make presentations followed by a Q&A. So with that, let me do a brief introduction. I'm Professor Crusto. I am here at Loyola, New Orleans. I teach property law and real estate transactions and wills, trusts, and estates. I'm a native New Orleanian. We can talk about some of the unique challenges of housing and race in New Orleans, but let's move on from there. In reverse order of speakers, I'm going to first of all introduce Professor Alexander, who is from Texas A&M in Houston. We mentioned earlier that there were some challenges of freezing temperatures and broken pipes and lack of electricity in Houston. I'm sorry to hear about some of the challenges that you faced there. We look forward to your comments. Professor Rosser, who is an old friend, was a Westerfield Fellow here at Loyola back when he was a young man years ago, when I was even younger than he was then. And somehow he's surpassed me in age. I don't know how that works. He's now at American University. We're really happy to have him back and then attorney, and we're going to designate her for today as Professor Hill, who is a Tulane graduate, the executive director of the Louisiana Fair Housing program here in New Orleans. So we're very excited. Professor Attorney Hill, you are first, I believe, on the list here. So we will start with your presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and sorry about the kind of late arrival. We've got a lot going on over here, and my 3-year-old now wants to be part of the presentation. So we're gonna get him out of the camera. I'm so sorry about this.
Oh, he's welcome. Happy to see him.
Well, he may have more important things to say than I do. I mean, he certainly thinks he does. So if you give me just a minute, I will be able to share my screen here.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry about this. So I am going to talk a little bit about how discriminatory housing policy has shaped Black experiences in the United States. And I've got my slides ready, so let me just get the screen share on. Let's see here. Okay, let's do this. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm getting there.
That's okay. The students are used to this. We go through this all the time.
Okay. Okay, I think I've got it. So there we go. Okay, so my name is Cashauna Hill, and I serve as Executive Director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. We are a nonprofit organization, not affiliated with the government in any way. We've been around since 1995, and the work that we do is mission-based work to end housing discrimination and segregation across Louisiana, and we do that work in a few different ways. We provide education and outreach services, meaning we do a lot of first-time home buyer trainings. We do a lot of know your rights trainings for tenants, letting people know what their rights are under the Fair Housing Act. We also provide free foreclosure prevention counseling for people who are having difficulty paying their mortgages. And then a lot of the work that we do is focused on policy advocacy to ensure equitable housing access, and then enforcement work, which is really our legal work. And we enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act to make sure that discriminatory housing policies and practices are challenged through litigation, as well as through conducting testing investigations where we train mystery shoppers and send them out in the community to help us determine whether and how housing discrimination is occurring. And I'm going to also apologize for the noise in the background. There is construction happening outside of my house. I hope it's not coming in too loud with the headset that I'm wearing. So a quick introduction to the Fair Housing Act and sort of what it's about and what it means. So in April of 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, and these pictures just kind of give you a quick glimpse into what was happening at the time that the Fair Housing Act was passed. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, and prior to his assassination, he had been working on getting Congress to pass what he was calling an open housing law that would end housing discrimination across the country. And there really hadn't been the political will that was necessary to get the law passed. However, due to the massive uprisings after the death of Dr. King, exactly 1 week after he was assassinated, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act into law. So the Fair Housing Act is the last of the civil rights laws that were passed in the United States. And what the Fair Housing Act does is a couple of things. We hear most often about this first goal of the Fair Housing Act, which I'm going to just quickly talk about. So the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination against people in any transaction related to housing. That's kind of the quick explanation of one of the Fair Housing Act's goals. So under the Fair Housing Act, there are 7 reasons why someone cannot be discriminated against, and we call those protected classes. So it's illegal under the Fair Housing Act to discriminate against someone in any housing related transaction because of their race, color, religion, national origin, sex, which was added in 1974, and which we would now most likely understand as gender, and then also familial status, meaning whether or not someone has children, as well as their disability. So these are sort of the 7 reasons why it's illegal to, or it would be illegal to discriminate against anyone based on one of these 7 reasons, again, in any housing transaction. So as I mentioned, there are 2 goals of the Federal Fair Housing Act. The first goal, again, we just discussed, makes individual acts of housing discrimination illegal. And the second goal is one that actually has been a little harder to get at. And that second goal requires that local governments address the legacy of racist housing policies in their communities and work to create open and integrated communities. So again, want to be very clear that the Fair Housing Act doesn't just work to, quote unquote, catch bad actors and stop one bad landlord from doing certain things. The Fair Housing Act really mandates that local governments actually look to redress and remediate the effects that racist housing policies have had on our communities. So I wanted to share a little bit about redlining in New Orleans. And I think most people may be familiar with the term redlining, so I won't talk about this a lot. But what I'm showing you here is a map that comes from 1937. It was put together by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board Division of Research and Statistics, again, by the U.S. federal government. And in the 1930s and 40s, as the United States government was working to make home ownership a goal primarily for white Americans, one of the ways that they did that was by deciding which neighborhoods would receive investments and where people would be able to get federally backed home loans in order to buy a house. In New Orleans, many of the areas that were redlined are still seeing the harmful effects of that discriminatory policy and those discriminatory policies even today. So I want to just show everybody here that the areas of New Orleans that were redlined in 1937, you can read what redlining meant or what a red designation meant here on this slide, but the areas that were redlined, and this is the language from the federal government, represent those neighborhoods in which the things that are now taking place in the C, meaning the yellow neighborhoods, have already happened. And here's the important point. The federal government decided that the areas that had detrimental influences in a pronounced degree and an undesirable population or an infiltration of it would be redlined. And we all know, even my 3-year-old knows red means stop, right? And so we think about redlining in these red communities, all investments were stopped. All opportunities for people to become homeowners in those communities were stopped. And I also want to be clear that communities were not redlined because, the African-American, the indigenous, the Latinx people in those communities, the Asian people in those communities were doing something wrong. They were redlined simply because there were people of color living in those communities, and our federal government, fully promoting and supporting white supremacy, had come to the conclusion that those neighborhoods that had people of color living in them, just by the virtue of having people of color living in them, would be starved of federal investments. So want to be very clear about that. Now, moving on, we can see, and I know the map is situated a little differently than the redlining map, but I hope that what you're able to see is that the neighborhoods that had been redlined in the 1930s in New Orleans are incredibly racially segregated. So what we see on this map coming from the 2010 census data, and of course, we'll be updating this as the information from the 2020 census becomes available. Here, this map shows Black people represented as green dots dots, and white New Orleanians are represented as white dots. This neighborhood over here, Lakeview, directly next to City Park, is a neighborhood that was green under the federal government's redlining map, and green meant go, right? And so these are neighborhoods that there was a lot of federal investment in. They were designated as A neighborhoods, hotspots, homogenous, and in demand, right? And so those neighborhoods that were designated green are now majority white communities in New Orleans that are well-resourced, high opportunity communities. So again, just giving you an indication of how the effects of redlining just still continue to play out today. Something else that it's important to note is that in those communities that were formerly redlined, which again are primarily in New Orleans, still now African-American communities, primarily African-American communities, we know that the life expectancy is much shorter than the life expectancy in those green communities that are still overwhelmingly white. So if we look at the Lakeview neighborhood, which again was a community that was shaded green on that map that I showed you earlier, that community is well over 90% white, and it has an average life expectancy of about 80 years. And I believe that Lakeview still has the highest life expectancy of any neighborhood in the state. Whereas the neighborhood, the Tulane Gravier neighborhood in zip code 70112, which is right in the shadow of the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, right, which is a huge symbol of wealth and status in this city, that neighborhood is 87% Black. It's only about 2.5 miles away from the Lakeview zip code, but the life expectancy there is about 25 years less. So again, we're continuing to see how discriminatory policies shapes some of what African Americans and people of color in this city experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about policing, and I did put some additional resources here on a slide, and I know that we'll get into more of this with the other panelists and the actual professors that are coming after me. So I hope this has been helpful just to kind of lay the historical groundwork, but I want to call your attention in particular to this second article that's listed here by Professor Bennett Capers, who is with Fordham University Law School. And all of these resources should be available online other than the two books that I've listed here, Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law and Matthew Desmond's Evicted. But Professor Capers' article, Crime, Surveillance, and Communities, really looks at the ways in which communities that have been redlined have experienced oppressive policing as we have continued to move forward from the legacy of redlining and discriminatory housing policy. And, you know, it's very clear to me, and one of the reasons why I'm in this work, and I always mention this, so if there are any students that I've interacted with before, I know you've heard me say this, one of the reasons that this work of ending housing discrimination is near and dear to my heart is that it's very clear to me that all of the continuing inequities that we see in American society have their roots in this country's history of yet unaddressed discriminatory housing policies. And so if we think about the overrepresentation of African Americans in our criminal legal system and the overrepresentation of Indigenous folks and Latinx folks in our criminal legal system, we know that much of that is tied to place, right? You know, once people were placed into these communities, and that's the real social engineering, right? We placed people of color into certain communities where they were then trapped by lack of access to jobs, transportation, and anything else that would provide them the ability sort of to move upward in terms of socioeconomic status. Once we placed people in these communities, well, then it became relatively easy for militarized police forces to go into those communities and criminalize the populations living there. And so Professor Capers in his work has really discussed sort of like even the idea around what who decided what constitutes a crime and who decided what behavior is criminalized, and then how do we apply those standards in different neighborhoods. And something else that I would call your attention to on this point is an article written by Richard Rothstein, and this is the second to the last resource listed here on this slide, that was written, I believe, in October of 2014. And so that article deals with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And it's called The Making of Ferguson, How Decades of Hostile Policy Created a Powder Keg. And that is also a foundational work in my mind in terms of the current day moment that we're in. If we think about and want to connect the Black Lives Matter and all of the protests that we're seeing after the murder of George Floyd last summer, we can tie, again, much of these policing tactics to this country's history of discriminatory housing policy. And I think people like Richard Rothstein lay out that case very well. So I will stop there because I know that there's a lot more to get to, and there will be a lot of great questions, I am hoping. And so with that, I'll wrap things up, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Attorney / Professor Hill. I'm going to ask you one question, and we're going to go to the next speaker. And then at the end of all the speakers, we'll open it up for Q&A. Reasonably so, you focused in on the city of New Orleans. And by the way, for the entire panel, apologies that we can spend an entire week on just housing discrimination. I mean, it's really a little bit unfair to kind of just kind of tie this in with just so many other. So what I want to ask you, since you're handling Louisiana, can you also kind of give us a bigger picture of the state? Because as you know, once there was integration of the city of New Orleans, we got more around the country, white flight to neighboring communities like Jefferson Parish and all the others. So where do we stand statewide? I mean, is there open housing in the state of Louisiana, or not?
No. Is the short answer. I mean, I don't know that there's truly open housing anywhere. There are certainly some states and municipalities that are working toward that goal and that have, created protections on, a state level or on a local jurisdictional level. Louisiana certainly has not created any statewide protections, and in fact has been quite resistant to the legislature has been quite resistant to providing protections for LGBTQ people. And we know that for many years, there has been a concerted effort by advocates and community members to get the legislature in Louisiana to ban discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation in housing and employment. And those bills usually don't even get out of committee. So unfortunately, while there are a few very dedicated fighters in the Louisiana state legislature, we live in a state where the lawmakers are not interested in providing those kinds of protections to people who continue to experience marginalization. So I would say there's a long way to go in terms of creating truly open housing. I haven't even talked about zoning and land use policies and how those policies can work to keep communities exclusive and exclusionary. And I can certainly talk more about that as we get into more Q&A. But at this time, we have, as a state, a long way to go. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. And one other question. In addition to the challenges that low-income residents seeking housing have, do you think that there's still even an issue for affluent African Americans and seeking open housing in the New Orleans and Louisiana area?
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate that question, Professor, because, you know, I'll say firstly that one thing that I noticed, and I don't know if our panelists have had, you know, similar experiences sort of in their work. Oftentimes when having these discussions, the conversation people try to very quickly move the conversation to a discussion of class issues rather than race, right? And I do feel like, and what I have noticed is that sometimes in spaces where the majority of audience members may be white or not be people of color, then there's more of a comfort level discussing class issues rather than race issues. But I want to be clear that these housing policies impact people of color and people who have experienced marginalization, no matter what their socioeconomic status, right? If we think about African Americans who are, you know, well-resourced, who have high levels of income, who have, you know, good jobs, quote unquote, they still experience discrimination in the private housing market. In New Orleans, we've studied this issue over the course of years, and we're seeing a discrimination rate of right at about 50%. So the last time we looked at this was in 2014, the Fair Housing Action Center did a study where we trained, again, testers, and we matched Black testers and white testers, and we looked at the access that African Americans would have to some of these well-resourced communities. So for those of you in New Orleans, we're talking about the East River Bend area, we're talking about Lakeview near Audubon Park. And in that study, we actually made sure to make our Black testers a little better qualified, quote unquote, than the white testers were. So they would have been on their jobs a little bit longer. They had higher incomes, maybe a college degree, and the white tester, you know, didn't have that credential. And when we sent those Black and white testers out, the African American testers, even these folks with high levels of income and high levels of education, they still experience discrimination about half the time. We also know that when African Americans become homeowners, right, we've seen a lot of stories recently about how African Americans face bias in the appraisal process. And there have been some enterprising folks who have done some testing on their own where, you know, a Black family may have an appraisal done and the numbers are coming in a little lower than they think they should. And if they've taken down pictures and had a white friend, you know, meet the appraiser, then lo and behold, the house is suddenly worth more. We know that about the values of African American homes in Black communities, right? Black homeowners are much more likely to live in lower income neighborhoods than actually are white renters. And then when African Americans do become homeowners in Black communities, their houses don't appreciate at the same rate that they would appreciate in a white neighborhood. So there are still a lot of disparities present that people of color experience in housing transactions, regardless of the level of their income or their socioeconomic status.
And as a follow-up to that, when you mentioned redlining, can you also mention or talk a little bit about the availability of financing for African Americans to purchase homes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question and a point that I left out. So absolutely. I mean, we know that African American and Latinx borrowers in particular, when they go to a bank looking for a home loan, even with the same credit scores and the same level of income as white borrowers, are going to receive worse loan terms. Again, statistically and generally speaking, an African American person, a Latinx person who goes into a bank with the same credit worthiness as a white lender is going to be steered to, as a white borrower, they're going to be steered into more expensive loans that have higher interest rates or more costs baked in. And again, the access to capital, even in working to become homeowners, is different based on race, and we still see that today.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you for indulging in my questions, which are a little bit out of turn. We're going to move on to Professor Rosser, who, as I said, is an old friend. Happy to see you back. And for all the speakers, we'll give you a free ticket. Professor, and Attorney Hill, you're already in New Orleans, but the other speakers are welcome to come to New Orleans in the future and have dinner on me at Dookie Chase restaurant in the 5th Ward where I grew up.
Well, thank you so much. I want to say that I have, as far as goals, pretty simple goals. So my first goal is to thank the people at New Orleans, at Loyola. It was the first place that hired me. I got my job there and really would not have had a career without a couple people, but there's a lot of people to thank. So I was a Westerfield Fellow with Craig, who's now a full-time professor. And I also, lots of people helped me while I was there. John Lovett, Mitch and I, because of Hurricane Katrina, we took a car back and forth to the Houston airport when we were teaching in the wake of Katrina out of Houston. Also, Davida, who I've gotten to know later, Rob, Isabel Medina, who I've gotten to know later, Bill, of course. I now do poverty law thanks to Bill and thanks to Katrina. So Katrina happened and they needed somebody to teach the poverty law class at Loyola. And it was me because Bill was busy with actually being a lawyer. And so they could put a junior person on that. And that has become my career in many parts because Loyola, of all schools, has the biggest commitment to poverty law of any school in the country. It's the only school where it's sort of a requirement. And so I remain thankful for that. Rob as well. And then the two that I really just have to, I learned how to teach from Pat Hugg and Mary Alguero. They were the supervisors for the Westerfield program when I was there. And they were and are models of how to be an engaged professor and a person who really puts the students first. So it is a privilege to be back. I will shift into my presentation. Let me say, our last speaker just said what I think is the most important. I was thinking, what do I most want people to know? And that is, if you have not read Color of Law, read it. That's it, right? So I think even for those of us who have written about race stuff for a long time, I mainly teach in areas of Indian law and poverty and housing. Color of Law is eye-opening because it has some examples, especially for me, of the West Coast racism that I was unaware of. And so when we were in New Orleans, my wife is light-skinned Latina. There was all sorts of racism that she encountered, even in the school. They had some speakers at the business school are just scary speakers. And she was getting her MBA. And I think what's nice about it is we sort of expect some racism in the South, but it's all throughout the country, and Color of Law does a good job showing that. So I'm going to move now on to my presentation. You can see the slides, I assume, right? Yeah? Okay. So my main idea, and one of the comments in the question says this, it says, if you're a dictator, what would you most want to do? Like, what policy are you pushing? And I'm really pushing to lessen the protections that single family high income zones get. That's my main goal. So, and I think that that is a valuable goal on the structural racism, because lots of the zoning, my thinking is, and this is not me, this is other people as well, but what I'm writing about is that deference to local zoning is a form of racism. And we see this in a lot of cities, that local zoning, right now it looks pretty neutral, but it wasn't always neutral. So let's pick on DC. DC has a great park. It's called the Rock Creek Park. It runs through the middle of the city. For years, it divided essentially the white northwest and the black east part of the town. That park was built deliberately. So it was lobbied for by the developer of Chevy Chase as a way to protect their investment from Black people in 16th Street. Right now, of course, DC's gentrifying everywhere. And so the line has shifted. But zoning has always been a way to protect the investment and protect the stability of wealthier whites. So what do I want to talk about first is just a reminder, and this is more of the academic side coming out. You know, one of the foundational cases we have is Euclid. And this is a slide, I don't get credit for this, but I saw somebody teach with this and I thought this was brilliant. It is a slide for a postcard of Euclid Avenue in Cleveland pointing towards Euclid, right? So it's showing, I think, well, the connection between Euclid, the town, and the city of Cleveland. And as we know from Euclid, the Supreme Court went ahead and allowed local deference to block the natural development of the city, of the larger city, metropolitan area. And they did so, and that's the main takeaway that we always get, is that Euclid allows local zoning. But it is worth reminding us, or reminding ourselves, that there were other parts. So one of the crucial things is that the court said that the holding was not meant, quote, to exclude the possibility of cases where the general public interest would so far outweigh the interest of the municipality that the municipality would not be allowed to stand in the way, right? So in some circumstances, regional needs are going to be big enough that they're going to have to, that the local government's going to have to give way on this when it comes to zoning. So the best example we have about this is, and there I am as a younger me, Mitch mentioned a younger me, there's younger me. This is the Ethel Lawrence Homes. And so Ethel Lawrence Homes, if you're interested, this is a great book on it. It's called Our Town, and it's about Mount Laurel, which is a suburb, depending on your perspective, of either Camden or Philly. But what's great about Mount Laurel, the book, is it describes, and I will say I was raised Quaker, the evil people, and you don't usually think of Quakers as evil. They're like the peace lovers, right? But in this story, the Quakers are the bad guys, right? The Quakers control this town, and they're blocking low-income African Americans from being able to move in. And they're doing so under a lot of different pretexts. And what the book ends is, and who are they fought with? They're fought by Ethel Lawrence. And I think the book makes a very good case that even though we don't know, most people don't know of Ethel Lawrence. They know of Rosa Parks, they know of others, but that Ethel Lawrence for the housing community should be on that level. That it is somebody who really championed, let's bring in African Americans to these more exclusive suburbs. Now, I did have people that are from Jersey say, well, you know, Mount Laurel is not the exclusive suburb. And I agree, there are more exclusive suburbs. This would apply to all those places as well. Sadly, these homes, which you can see are built sort of in Hope 6 design, nice suburbia. When they came in, they were not nearly as dramatically negative for the community as all the community expected, right? So they sort of fade in the background. They actually are behind a row of trees, like most of the communities there. You can't really tell. But yet this was a multi-generational fight to even get this level of affordable housing. So that's really our best example of going against the local and for the sake of the municipal. And there are other scholars, this is more for the academics, there are other scholars that also are trying to figure this out, right? How do we selectively allow localism, but get rid of localism when it's acting bad, or doing bad things? Nestor, I think, comes out with an article that says we should do this when essentially good progressive things are at stake, but not when it's for bad conservative things. I think the hard part is making that line, right? So to start with, though, it's worth noting, and I definitely appreciate the last comment, that there is a danger of class issues swallowing the race issues, right? And I think we see that certainly around DC, where one of the great things about DC is there are parts in this where there is a large middle class community of African Americans in some of the suburbs, right? Which is fairly unique. But nevertheless, on this, one of the things that we notice is that around all these cities, single family home zones are blocking development. Just huge areas zoned for single family home. You go there, Woodbridge is right near New Haven. Woodbridge is on 3-acre lots. Now they say that it's to protect the water supply or because there isn't septic, but that's a choice, right? It's a choice not to provide services as a means to keep the housing pretty exclusive. Another example, and this is the most challenging one, is what do we do about the fact that sometimes greater density is not good for poor communities, right? So, and I think this is a very hard issue. I think the problem with this is the counterfactual. We don't actually know what it would look like to allow more density, right? So right now, how is it that cities do this? They will open up a struggling part of town for a little bit more density. There will be displacement because developers will see the land there, and that will result in displacement of poor African American or Latino populations. But what we don't see is a city really taking the possibility of density seriously, opening up areas like, again, I'm sorry, I don't know New Orleans well enough. In New Orleans, it's uptown, right? But we don't see them deciding those nice houses next to the park should be more dense. Instead, they decide other areas should be more dense, but we're still going to protect the parts of uptown that are sort of wealthy. So what's the challenge with this? One of the things is that right now there are a lot of people actually concerned about density. Obama, right before the end of his term, came out with a paper saying we need more density. We need to get rid of some of these restrictions, and it will have all of these follow-on consequences. So one person described this as the elite libertarianism. Right. And that makes me nervous. I don't think of myself as a libertarian. I think of myself as a social democrat or something like that. Right. So, but nevertheless, I think there's a possibility of the left and the right coming together on the idea that zoning is acting to block people from moving to areas of opportunity. And in order for this sort of coming together to happen, the left needs to admit that they might have been wrong about ignoring the effects of regulation, in particular zoning, on new construction. And the right needs to demonstrate that they actually do care about the poor, not that they were just using it as a hammer in the argument. Right? So there's been a number of work. I'm going to skip quickly just because I care more about the questions and the discussion. There has been work. So the place that we're seeing this sort of play out the most is in California, where California has different initiatives, really led by one member of the state house, to try to allow greater density. And they're doing it for all sorts of reasons. But one of them is that the worker, so my brother lives in California. He's a professional guy with a very good education. They can barely afford it. So that means that people that have real jobs cannot be anywhere near the city, right? We're deciding that entire regions are closed off. And as that movie, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, sort of highlights, it's closed off on race and class lines, right? So there have been efforts to try to deal with this. And I do think California is going to be the main mover on this, or the early mover. But it's other things. So one example, just with poor people in general, is lots of places don't like mobile homes. And so states have had to come in and say, no, mobile homes in some communities are a good thing. We need to allow that sort of housing. There are, of course, concerns. And the main concern about going against local zoning is people, let's just be honest, like your professors, often benefit, right? We have homes in nice areas. We're living in many ways, some of us, the American dream. I grew up poor. I'm now not poor. And it's threatening to people that they would have to have more density near them. It threatens their stability, which they, it's largely a product of luck, but they contribute to skill. And that's a negative thing, right? It also is seen as a negative because some cities are now attractive again in ways they weren't before, and density might threaten that, right? So another idea, of course, is that, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge to the idea that we should go with more state zoning or greater density, is that cities have become a progressive center, right? So it's no coincidence that things like the Fight for 15 requires some density, right? It requires a movement. And some of these are very valuable things for progressive causes. They're not housing per se. I think in housing, my answer to this when it comes to progressives is progressives are now progressive on every issue. They're progressive on how families define. They're progressive on race. They are not giving up their nice house and their nice development. So I will stop there. This is the last two thoughts is this is nothing new. There have been people writing about this for a long time. If you're interested in an early one, there was a very good book on this. Cheryl Cashin's book is really nice on the way in which we are keeping communities sort of separate and doing so through property law. We do see efforts to get rid of local deference, but only when elites see the advantage. So metro systems or sort of connections. But I think as we can see from this Trump tweet, it matters, right? I'll just pick on myself. I am living the suburban lifestyle dream. My house is protected. And frankly, that's a bad thing, right? And so we need to figure out how to lessen the degree of protection that wealthier people like your professors and others enjoy. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. You're muted, Mitch.
So if I only knew how to unmute, I would make a fortune. Thank you, Professor Rosser, and thank you for your shout out to all the wonderful mentors that you had at Loyola. I share your thoughts about it. Before we go on to Professor Alexander, let me kind of probe you for a minute. Clearly, you recognize that density does not equal affordability. What we're experiencing in parts of New Orleans, particularly in the Bywater area, are condominium complexes that are going up. They're getting special treatment. They're getting special financial benefits. They call themselves mixed income, but they're really not. And so we're getting density and exclusivity, both in terms of affordability and race. Mm-hmm. And I know you kind of commented on that. You want to comment a little bit further?
Yeah. So I think that's a real concern. I think two answers to that. One is, there's no question we as a society need to have affordable housing, and that the poor can't afford the amount that they could pay on the income side, can't support new construction plus maintenance of units.
And the middle class.
And the middle class. We cannot build units at the price that they can afford to pay. And that means there has to be deeper subsidies, right? So I'm relatively agnostic about which type of subsidy, but I think Evicted, one of the things Evicted did, we've already given the shout out to Color of Law. Evicted also should be on everyone's reading list. Elisa and I have written about this together for the same symposium. One of the things Evicted does that's great is show, one is that we just don't care. As a society, if we cared, we would give more subsidy. And his end goal at the book says we need much deeper subsidies on the voucher side. I'm a little less pure voucher versus other sorts of housing subsidies. But that being said, there's no question that's right. I think the other thing, though, that Evicted shows is that most poor people, and this is the part that students don't come to class knowing, poor people live in market rate housing. So it's crap often, it is not decent housing necessarily, but it is still market provided housing. Now, of course, the filter down model has its limits. I think, we had in the 50s to 70s greater potential for that than perhaps we have now, but we also need to just allow housing to develop. And we, until we had a real commitment to public subsidy, we can't have the position that because we don't have public subsidy, we also can't turn on the spigot a little bit on supply.
Yeah, and thank you for that. When you mentioned public subsidy, just for some of the students, perhaps Section 8 vouchers would be an example, but also, of course, government-owned housing. In the city of New Orleans, pre-Katrina, we had substantial public housing known as projects, which were historically white, but turned out later to become African Americans as whites fled to the suburbs. After Katrina, as you know, there was a substantial redevelopment. They talk about zoning, the experiment of zoning in New Orleans. You might want to speak a little bit about public housing, the demise of public housing, perfectly good, unflooded public housing. People weren't even allowed to go back into their homes to get their personal belongings. They were basically shut out. And then these houses were destroyed for new development for developers to make money. And second of all, eminent domain, how zoning was used in eminent domain to take out housing in the mid-city area to provide for the VA hospital and the LSU Medical Center.
Yeah, and there's actually, I thought saw on the attendee list, somebody that could do a much better job than me. I remember when, Katrina hit and we were watching the news and Bill Quigley was very much front and center trying to preserve this public housing on behalf of all of the rest of us, right? And I think, when Katrina happened, I had been troubled by the racism in New Orleans. Like you go to the Fly, that park that, and when I was there, at least, it was divided. There was, I tell the story, there was the Latinos playing soccer, there were white hippies playing Frisbee, there were black families in other parts of the park, and then there was the Tulane frat boys on another part. It was a divided city, and I knew that before Katrina. But after Katrina, the thing that really stood out for me was an ad by one of the mayoral candidates where it's him standing in front of a white picket fence, not another person to be seen, declaring subtly the end of New Orleans as a black city, right? And I, frankly, it was very disturbing for me, the way that it played out post New Orleans, especially also the anti-Latino part. I think that, that New Orleans is always a case study, because unlike other cities, you actually have some proximity. You can have poor people and minority people relatively close to wealthier white people. And so the contrast is greater than you have in the close proximity than you have in other parts of the country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There'll be clearly questions from the audience. Let's go on to Professor Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I had to unmute myself. Everyone can hear me? Great. Well, I want to first do what the other panelists have done and really thank the Loyola Law Review and Loyola School of Law for inviting me. I don't have the deep wealth of experience that Professor Rosser has, and I'm not in New Orleans, but I visited New Orleans before, and I have some definite friends on the faculty, particularly John Lovett, who has been a longtime friend of our family. And then also your former dean, Maria Pabon, has been a longtime friend of mine. Actually, we knew each other when we were kids, and she's a little older than me. So when she was in law school, she motivated me to want to go to law school. And so it's nice to be here, and thank you for having me be part of this wonderful event. So I am at Texas A&M School of Law, which I just wanted to clarify is actually in Fort Worth. And I live in Dallas, and why that's relevant is that the story that I want to tell today is a story from the city of Dallas. But Professor Crusto was right that we are having some challenges all throughout the state: Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and other places. But this story that I want to tell is a story about a community called the 10th Street Historic District in Dallas. And it draws from some scholarship that I'm developing called Vernacular Historic Preservation Law that will be an article, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. Okay, let's see, can I go forward? Okay, so first, since this is a conference about structural racism, I wanted to kind of put a definition of structural racism out there, right? It's a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various and often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And it also identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. And structural racism is not something that just a few people or institutions choose to practice, or something that's just a mens rea or a hate that one or two people have. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. And so that robust definition is sort of a complex way of saying that structural racism says that racism is kind of baked in to the cake of American society in ways that are very hard to just pull out because it's such an endemic systemic part of our society. And as my two former panelists have said, in housing, this could not be more true, right? I mean, it's so baked into the cake of housing markets and housing policy in the United States that it's really hard to sort of say when it started and exactly how to pick out, exactly how to fix it without looking at the problem in a systemic way. And so what is also true, right, is that because of structural racism and systemic racism in housing, people will be making decisions about their housing choices. Market forces will be making choices about financing housing in ways that perpetuate structural racism and perpetuate racism, even if they don't hate Black people, even if they don't even if they have a Black friend in school, et cetera, right? It's baked in to the cake. So in my presentation, I want to talk about many of the things that have already been touched on, but how they apply to Dallas and the 10th Street Historic District, right? So in Dallas, was also redlined by the homeowners loan corporation, as Cashauna Hill explained in her presentation. There was 114 different metropolitan areas in the United States that were redlined and designated in this way. As she explained, blue is the best, was literally called the best neighborhood. Green was the best. Blue was still desirable. Yellow was definitely declining, and red was hazardous, right? That was the designation. And so the community that I want to talk about is D3, a redlined community back in 1930 that contained significant numbers of Black people. This other graphic on the other side of the homeowners loan corporation map is showing what that community looks like today. So just as Cashauna Hill showed in her presentation, the same community that was redlined in 1937 in Dallas, it's the Oak Cliff neighborhood. 10th Street is a part of the Oak Cliff neighborhood in Dallas. That is still a neighborhood that has high numbers of minorities and is still experiencing high levels of low-income individuals, and also negative outcomes in the same way that Cashauna Hill said in her presentation, life expectancy, et cetera. And when we looked at the coronavirus and the effects of it, and where there was more proliferation of the virus, where people had a harder time from job losses, et cetera, those outcomes also occurred in this same red line community. Now, what I'm interested in particular is, and here's one of the statistics that I was showing. This particular graphic shows some research from the University of Richmond in which they compared the outcomes on demographic levels and health outcomes from the red line community in the 1930s and today. And they were showing similar outcomes. It was 35% Negro, which is the term that was used in 1937 to describe African Americans. And now it's now still 48.4% minority. Life expectancy is lower than others, et cetera. The community that I wanted to talk about within this broader area of Oak Cliff in Dallas is something called the 10th Street Historic District, Freedmanstown. So people may or may not know that after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and slaves were freed, Texas, the slaves heard about it a little later than everybody else. And that's basically the celebration of the holiday Juneteenth, right? The idea that it wasn't until later on June 19th, almost 2 years later, that the African-American or Black slaves in Texas found out that they were actually free. And once they found out that they were free, they decided to go find communities that they could reside in. And those were called freedom colonies. And they were informal, unincorporated settlements of Black farmers and stockmen and their families. And in Dallas, in the 10th Street area, was one of these freedom colonies or freedmen's towns. In 1870, African Americans only owned about 1.8% of the land in Texas. But after the Emancipation Proclamation and when this freedmen's town was created, it then rose to 26% and then to a high of 31% in 1900. And the 10th Street Historic District, let me go back, the 10th Street Historic District was a bustling Black community at that time. There were doctors and lawyers and others who were very productive. There was wealth in the community at that time. But after the Depression, right, these uninformal, unincorporated communities experienced hard times. And the fair housing efforts of the Federal Housing Administration and others to help people after the Depression, Blacks in these communities did not receive that help, right? And so in many ways, the community began to deteriorate because of the failure to receive many of the governmental subsidies and benefits that were put in place after the Depression. Those benefits went to white people and they did not go to Black people. Further, in the city, basically in around the 1940s, started to not invest in these communities. And there was an effort in 1950 to use eminent domain to demolish the communities that existed there and to put a big highway right through the middle of the 10th Street Historic District. So the highway construction demolished 175 original homes. There were some historic structures that remained, but this community was basically decimated and destroyed by eminent domain. The eminent domain that was used called this community blighted, and it was called blighted primarily just because Black people lived there, because in fact, the community did have doctors and lawyers and commerce and other things in the community, yet because it was a Black community, it was designated as blighted, and that provided the justification to take over homes in that area, many of them not receiving fair or best compensation or adequate compensation for their homes, and then a highway was put through it. When the highway occurred, then some of the African Americans that perhaps were more middle class, that were part of the business lawyering communities, some of them moved to other places. And the opportunities to move to the suburbs that the federal government subsidized and underwrote, they also didn't go to African Americans either, right? And so then this community began to fall into significant disrepair. Okay, so what happens is today, this community is still a low-income African-American community, but it's very close to some very dynamic and productive parts of our city. It's near the Dallas Zoo. It's got a nationally ranked magnet school right in the area. And this 10th Street area, however, the housing and the structures, because of disinvestment, because of putting the highway through it, because of eminent domain, and because of that designation of Black communities as hazardous, meant that people didn't have the money they needed, and many of the houses fell into disrepair. As a result, even though the community in 1993 and 1980s organized to try to, I'm sorry, my dog is going there and my husband's not doing anything about my dog, so I'm sorry about my dog. But even though in 1986, the communities tried to get a historic designation for 10th Street, they were able to, in 1993, have the 10th Street area declared a historic district. And what that should do from a zoning perspective is protect the housing and the homes within that district from being demolished, from being desecrated because of its historic value. However, what they found when they did research is that the city in 2010 came up with a housing policy or a code policy, an ordinance, which said that homes that were smaller than 3,000 square feet and dilapidated could be demolished. And so as a result, even though this neighborhood had this historic designation, was a place where slaves came from, there were people actually living in the community, it was suddenly a community that you could demolish houses in, compared to the white historic areas in Dallas, which are completely protected. You cannot just demolish areas in white historic districts within the city of Dallas. And so the Inclusive Communities Project and a bunch of other, and the Legal Aid of Northwest Texas and a bunch of other legal organizations decided to use the Fair Housing Act that Cashauna Hill did a great job of explaining what it is, to say, actually, we should be able to stop this demolition of important homes that Black people own, that are historic, right, in this community at a disproportionate rate compared to whites. And that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act, both because it's disparate treatment, treating Blacks and whites differently in the same type of designation, but also because the 2010 code policy of demolishing homes that are smaller than 3,000 square feet ended up having a disparate negative impact on African Americans because they were having their homes demolished at a greater rate than those of whites. There were something like 70 in structures of, I think it was I'm trying to think of how many structures there were. There were something like 72 homes out of 260 were demolished in this area compared to 1, 2, or 3 maybe in white areas. I am elevating this example of systemic racism because what it shows is how the initial decisions of the state and of the city that structured this community of color as a community of disadvantage, right? Then when the neighborhood is gentrifying, et cetera, they then have another set of policies that then operate to deprive people of their homes, to not give them the funds that they need to revitalize in important ways. And that this is a good example, to my mind, of another way of applying the Fair Housing Act to redress systemic discrimination. One of the huge focuses within fair housing communities in implementing the Fair Housing Act has been to promote integration and to encourage mobility, meaning to ensure that low-income African Americans or African Americans of moderate means can move into communities and not be discriminated against on the basis of race. And much of that mobility has encouraged low-income people of color to move to more moderate income white communities where there may be better schools and more opportunity. And I think that's important and great and an important part of enforcing the Fair Housing Act and should continue. In Texas, we had the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project Supreme Court case, which upheld the Fair Housing Act. And that case was all about discrimination and against race in Dallas and throughout Texas, and the ways in which housing policy and citing affordable housing was reproducing those negative racial outcomes. But a lot of the focus was on how do we get Black people out of where they are into some productive community of color, white community that's going to have better outcomes. What I think is interesting about this particular story is that it shows the reverse, that in some ways there are Black communities that have an important history, even though they're low income and even though they're segregated, and that there should be reasons that we use law to keep those people in place and to help those people benefit from the revitalization that's occurring around them. And so rather than using the Fair Housing Act just to move some people to somewhere else, we ought to also use it to help people remain in place who want to and remain in place to benefit from the gentrification that's happening around them. It also shows how a series of governmental actions at the city and state and local levels have perpetuated the original racism and segregation really from slavery. And that the failure to take governmental actions to remedy that, right? The failure to say, hey, we shouldn't demolish houses in this particular historic district. Instead, we should provide funds to revitalize them. We should have property tax abatements, and we should elevate the history of this community. Instead, government is saying, oh, those are dilapidated, they're not very good, so we're just gonna knock them all down. That is perpetuating the segregation and the discrimination that created these communities as communities of disadvantage in the beginning. And so what I've been interested in, and then I'm gonna stop, is how we can use law like the Fair Housing Act and other laws to help preserve communities, to help empower communities, and to help recognize that the cities are changing in important ways. Communities that are low income and minority communities are sometimes facing revitalization and gentrification, and moving everybody out of those areas and getting rid of public housing in those areas and getting rid of affordable housing in those areas, right? To have them move somewhere else. Okay, if they want to do that, that should be possible. But in many ways, it's missing the changes that are happening in cities. And we might want to use law to keep people in place when they want to be in place and when the area is revitalizing in important ways. So what was great about this lawsuit was that the city did halt the demolition of these homes as a result of this litigation. And there are creative ideas where you could pair this historic district with property tax abatements and rehabilitation money that allows them to revitalize these homes and correct the code violations, that helps them to resurrect some of the communities and businesses that were there many years ago. This is all efforts that federal government, state government, and local government could do if they wanted to see these communities differently. And so that's a little bit of what I'm writing about with vernacular preservation, is that one new aspect of historic preservation law should not be to just preserve high art or patriotic buildings that are George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or whatever, but to also include vernacular culture and to see how historic preservation law and zoning could actually be used to combat historic cultural displacement and to mitigate structural racism. That's a new way of looking at it. And I've written a little bit more about that. And I've written about vernacular culture, and I want to skip that a little bit to get to questions. But one of the things I think we need to think about is how do we reorient some of the laws that exist, the duty to affirmatively further fair housing that all localities have, the ways in which localities can zone and use historic districts in ways that protect people. These should all be part of our thinking about how law could be reoriented to mitigate discrimination and to remedy historic discrimination. That needs to be part of the conversation. Additionally, I feel that there's this discussion in public discourse, sort of like there's so many ways in which systemic racism undermines people of color in criminal law, in education, in housing. And many people just think, oh, you know, we should just be used to that, right? Like people of color are just disadvantaged and white people are advantaged by their status. And that's a good thing. And we ought to continue that because white people feel that they disproportionately benefit from that. And, you know, African-Americans are kind of the disadvantaged individual and that that's okay. And that people in some ways expect for there to be disadvantage along racial lines. It's part of the sort of white supremacist setup. But the thing that I think is important to remember is that it does not have to be this way, and that not only do these outcomes negatively affect low-income minorities, people of color in ways that, you know, somewhat undermine our stated values of life, liberty, and happiness, the ownership of property, et cetera. Not only do they hurt those communities, but they also really hurt white people in ways that I think that they have not quite understood, seen, or recognized, right? So it prevents people from living in the kinds of integrated communities that they might have benefits from, right? This kind of unintentional but you know, disparate impact decision making means that white people are in overwhelmingly white communities. They're often in overwhelmingly white schools. They often don't get to benefit from interactions that might help them in the future as communities become more diverse. It means that their homes are undervalued. So if you're a middle-class white person who lives in a community that's kind of close to some people of color, your house is not going to be worth as much, even if you have a perfectly nice house. That actually hurts you, right? You should be concerned about that, not just because you're concerned about the effects on African Americans, because it limits your possibilities. Additionally, and this is my final concluding point, is that many of the problematic policies that we see in African-American communities, that originate in African-American communities, the problematic market practices and some of the problematic legal practices that states and cities and laws and other markets undertake, they often originate in low-income communities. And the failure to, in low-income minority communities. And so the failure to actually look at what's happening in those communities and to care about it, not only hurts the people in those communities, but it precludes us from seeing how law and markets are being used in ways that might be problematic. The best example of this was in the 2008 foreclosure crisis, where subprime lending and predatory lending was really problematic. It originated in low-income minority communities. Those practices were legitimated there. Practices of kicking people out of their homes in illegal ways after foreclosures, those were all legitimated in minority communities. But the failure to see that precluded people from seeing how those practices were becoming normalized and then eventually affected broader white communities. And there's a case in so many examples. Even this code violation example is an example of a practice that could eventually affect white communities. And so I think it's important for us not only to address systemic racism for the deleterious effects that it has on communities of color, but also because it shows us problematic practices and problematic legal practices and market practices that we might want to change because they'll eventually affect everyone. So that's it.
All I can say is, wow. Well, thank you very much, Professor Alexander. We're going to start questions in a minute, but I wanted to probe a couple of thoughts before we move on. And first of all, apologies. Yeah, Texas A&M is in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. Near my sister, who's in Arlington, Texas, so I should know better. And I apologize for that. You're not in Houston. And thank you for that. And you mentioned, of course, the historic district in 10th Street in your neighborhood, your community. Very similar in New Orleans, the Treme area. And of course, right off the French Quarter. You know, we had I-10, you know, roll in and take out, you know, some valuable African-American historic homes. and on and on and on. And after Katrina, we took out one of the most historically significant sources of the development of jazz in the New Orleans area, which is the Basin Street area. Basin Street, which had a number of nightclubs, are now basically turned into condos. We've had jazz clubs on Rampart Street that when outsiders came in and said, gee, we don't want to live in the French Quarter because there's so much noise on Rampart Street. There's all that late night music. And so they changed the zoning and closed down all of the nightclubs. There's no more nightclubs on Rampart. I think there's one more maybe left on Basin Street. There's, I think, one left on Claiborne Avenue. So, it's kind of crazy. You kind of mentioned, when you do those things in the cultural, you're basically ripping out the culture, the history of our country. Who would want to destroy Beale Street? Just go through the various places where, music has developed in this country. It's worldwide recognized. So that's point number one. Thank you for that. And I also want to explore with you, we have a tendency to go back in history and talk about how our present problems are tied to slavery. You certainly, all speakers have pointed out that these are not historic problems. These are contemporary problems. These are problems that we need to tackle today. And one of those in terms of gentrification, which I'd like you to talk about a little bit further, is real estate tax policy. So in New Orleans, we have people who have been in their homes for hundreds of years, in their neighborhoods for hundreds of years, who are basically being bought out because they can't afford the rising real estate property taxes. Can you talk a little bit about that and any kind of ideas that maybe can be utilized today to keep people in their homes?
Yes. So thank you for that. New Orleans is actually part of the broader article that I want to talk about with historic preservation law, and there's other examples across the country. But the problem of property tax abatement, well, one, there's all kinds of, my colleague Bernadette Atuahene has also done some great work on property tax, basically predatory behavior, where people are using property tax foreclosures as a way of taking homes from low-income African Americans in Detroit and other places. But property tax abatement is one of those sort of insidious solutions that often localities resist, right? So the idea is that people want to get as much tax revenue as they can. People, meaning cities and states and the people who run them, want to get as much tax revenue as they can to operate, local government from houses in their areas. And so what that means, right, is that low-income African-American communities that are close to revitalizing areas, the actual land value, even if the homes in that area are not themselves appraised highly or worth a lot, the land begins to take on value. And then local communities say, okay, well, we ought to tax those people in a way that helps us get more revenue from them, because we could have other people living in here that would pay us more, and that's good for us as a city. But what's problematic about that from a historical perspective, right, is that it's operated to take low-income minorities who maybe do own their homes, but are one paycheck away from foreclosure, from being able to afford their homes, because property taxes are rising much higher than their income. And so that leads people to foreclosing and losing their homes. I think what's problematic about the view that localities have that we should just kind of keep raising the taxes on these people because we need the revenue, is that it means people are being displaced. People who own and may eventually, with adequate support, might be able to own their homes and revitalize their homes and contribute in positive ways to the local community, are actually being displaced. And then the problems that come along with displacement and eviction and foreclosure move to some other part of the city, right? Now, some people say, well, if it moves out of my city, I don't care, right? But these problems are kind of regional, right? And so moving the problem, just a few feet away, right, and not solving the problem is not a good solution. And so I do think property tax abatements are an important solution, where there's certain communities, particularly if they're low income, particularly if they're like the community that I described in the 10th Street, where there's not a lot of income, people own their homes or they're renting there, they don't have the money for rehabilitation and code enforcement. The national Register of Historic Places did eventually give $75,000 to that neighborhood to revitalize. And the city should be giving money and giving property tax abatements to make sure that people don't have to pay full taxes. Another thing that you could do is you could put those homes, if the residents of those areas are willing, in like a municipal community land trust or a nonprofit owned community land trust that would put some restrictions on the homes and the rate at which they could be sold and who they could be sold to. And then those restrictions would provide a basis for assessing the taxes differently. So if the prices of the homes are somewhat restricted, then you would not assess them at total full value, right? And that might give people time to be able to catch up and afford the property taxes. So these are all ideas that I think should be in the hopper. And I think localities need to start thinking about this differently. They need to slow normal market processes down in ways that empower people rather than disadvantage them.
Great, thank you. And I see Attorney Hill / Professor Hill wants to jump in on this.
I apologize. I actually don't need to jump in. I just was realizing that Professor Alexander's point, some of it felt like it tied to the CNN article that I was attempting to post in the chat. And then I realized, oh my goodness, I think I only sent it to the panelists. So everything that I sent during the other panelists' presentations, I'm now trying to send out to everyone. So I apologize for not being able to work technology today.
Yeah, well, the resources are great. And I think the connections between Cashauna's presentation and mine are really good. And as well as what Ezra's saying, which is that being willing to have more density is another solution to this. But I think what's happening is that localities are thinking about these problems in very traditional ways, where they want traditional market approaches. They want, people to be able to the highest and best use. They worry about low-income people and what that will do to the market, prices of homes, and they have resistance from local people who say, okay, any low-income person near me is going to be, bring my property values down, so I don't want that. And all of that really is ignoring the unique ways in which some solutions have been proffered that don't actually lead to people's property value going down precipitously, or people being in high crime areas and all these other kind of narratives that I think in some ways have their origins in slavery, but have continued to perpetuate to this day.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, panelists. I know there's a lot we can discuss. You're brilliant and you've done great work, and we continue to support all of your efforts, and thank you for helping us in that regard. Let's go to the to the audience and see if we can get this working. I think if Jillian can help out as usual with maybe you want to stop the hand-raised people and get them to be seen and heard.
As we're waiting for people to get the hand, I would say one thing just in line with Lisa's point on whether it's continued or not. There is a community very similar to the one Lisa was describing in Bethesda, which is a very upper income suburb of DC. And the one area that was a former, right after the Civil War, African Americans lived there. They lived there in sort of not very formal housing. HUD came in and then converted it into HUD housing, and sort of there are positive and negatives, but the positive did provide better housing. But the telling part was Bethesda and Montgomery County had a choice on which rec centers to improve. And the last rec center in the entire county that they decided to renovate was in this one pocket of essentially blackness within Montgomery County.
Thank you for that.
I did want to know if it would be okay. I know Jillian is there are questions, and I didn't know if it would be okay to quickly address some that are in the Q&A section, or I don't know if that's what was going to happen, and I didn't want to jump the gun. A couple of thoughts that I had, though, to just kind of tie some things together. I know Professor Crusto, you had mentioned about sort of what's happening in the Bywater neighborhood here in New Orleans, and I do want to note that in the CNN article that I posted in the chat, which talks about how climate change is really speeding up gentrification and Black displacement in New Orleans and in Miami, there are some links to the situation about what's going on in the Bywater. And so I would encourage people to just kind of read that article and then kind of click through some of the links, and you can get a little bit more information about how African Americans that really built that community have been displaced. Also, definitely wanted to just take the opportunity to shout out the work of Bill Quigley. I know Professor Rosser had mentioned him. Just always honor and respect to the work that Bill does, and Davita Finger at Loyola as well. I did see a question about whether or not the prohibition on sex discrimination in the Fair Housing Act protects people on the basis of sexual orientation and transgender people. And actually the answer is yes, but, right? So the law written in 1968 doesn't specifically say that people are protected on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But what has happened is that belatedly and thankfully, some federal courts have started to recognize a right to protection on those two bases because of the protection on the basis of sex. And what they have found is that transgender folks and folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual are often subjected to discrimination because of stereotypes associated with their sex, right? And so if a same-sex couple applies to rent an apartment together, it's just a basic example, and, you know, are denied, then the claim under the Fair Housing Act that might be successful because of the way courts are now reading the laws are that if they were an opposite sex couple, right, then they would not have been denied. So they're being treated differently and discriminated against because of assumptions about the way they should, quote unquote, behave due to their sex or gender. So that's kind of the lawyerly, more complicated answer. The law does not specifically include those protections, but again, courts have read those protections into the Federal Fair Housing Act. So I did want to note that, and we are thankfully under the new Biden administration, there's been this same kind of progress happening at HUD as well. And so HUD has just within the past couple of weeks come out with some guidance clarifying that in the federal government's mind, people are protected from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I just wanted to say that.
Very good. Unfortunately, as you know, the discrimination is contingent upon one's ability to pay. And so if you don't have the monies to reach these increasing cost of living, rents and purchases, it's hard to prove a case of discrimination because we don't use financial as kind of a criteria, except, I guess, for accessibility by lenders. Is that accurate?
I think I need a. I don't know if I quite understand the question. So,
well, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that there are studies that show that as we have basically made discrimination illegal, one of the results has been a market change where we've increased the pricing for housing. And in order to show discrimination, you have to show that you're financially qualified. So if at one time to rent out an apartment in New Orleans was $800 a month for a one bedroom, and now it's $1,200 a month, you have to at least show that you were able to pay the $1,200 before you can show you were being discriminated against. Is that accurate?
Okay, I think I see the question. I don't know if that is necessarily accurate because the ability to afford the apartment is not a prerequisite to proving a claim, right? The elements, and I know I'm talking to law students and professors, so we all know about elements of a prima facie case, and so it's not necessary to prove that you could afford the apartment or the housing opportunity in order to prove a discrimination case per se. But what I will say is that to your point, we do often see financial requirements implemented as a way to get around some of the Fair Housing Act requirements, right? So I'm thinking particularly Seattle, for instance. Seattle, the city council has passed a law that prohibits, it bans the box in housing, right? So now landlords are not allowed to ask about any criminal legal history as a way to keep people out. And so what we've kind of seen, what housing advocates have seen, is that right away landlords turned around and said, okay, well, if I can't keep out people based on whatever legal history they may have, now I'm going to be raising the rents, or I'm going to be requiring a 700 credit score in order to rent an apartment, because they see, making the apartments more difficult to get into as a way to get around the requirements of the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I also just say something on that point? I mean, so it's clearly not part of the requirements of making out a claim, but I think what is an underlying part of your question is that source of income, right, and source of income discrimination is a major problem, right? And it's a major problem that has disparate impacts because a large number of African-American women are huge numbers of people who have Section 8 vouchers, who not necessarily meaning that there's no white people who are Section 8 voucher holders, because that's definitely not true, but that they're disproportionately part of that population. And so this discrimination can sort of be, I'm not discriminating against you because you're a Black woman with a child, but we just don't take Section 8 here, can be an argument often that is made. And so it's sometimes hard to pick out exactly, what the basis is upon which you're being discriminated against. Similarly, even if we're not talking about people who have subsidies like Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, people who are of color who have, maybe have the income to be able to afford a house in a more white neighborhood, because of steering and some of the other things that Cashauna talked about, they're not even going to be shown that home, right? Even if they have the financial wherewithal to be able to actually afford the home, because they're just going to sort of say, this is a neighborhood of white people, and so we're not going to take people of color there. I just wanted to share a personal story in that regard is because I'm a housing professional and I'm African-American, I know about these issues. So I've learned, right, how you get around those problems. So when I choose to buy a house, I just don't appear.
Yep.
I don't appear. I don't show up physically, and I have somebody who's white, who's a broker.
We used to send our white cousins in New Orleans.
Yeah, I just don't show up, because if you look at my profile on paper, I could have access to so many different things. But if people see that profile and then see that I'm also of color, they're going to deny me those opportunities, even if I can afford them economically. So I think it is a very complex factor where the cost of the housing comes in, but it's also the cost plus race.
Well, and then when you get in, let's talk about South Lake, Texas. I assume you know South Lake's story, right? So tell us a little bit about South Lake. Even when you're a person of color in a predominantly affluent and well-heeled white community of South Lake, Texas, what happens then?
Well,
Are you good? Are you safe?
No, you're not necessarily safe. You have to worry about, the police following you and these kinds of things. Yeah, I mean, I have been with a fanny pack and, dog poop bags and my dog walking in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I totally have police follow me when I'm doing that, right? So, I mean, it's not like, just because you have a higher income, these issues don't affect you. But I think that the challenge, right, is getting people to not use that thinking as their initial way of thinking of it. So for example, I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. I got here because I didn't appear and nobody knew I was Black. When I arrived, people were a little like, oh, we didn't really know. But now that we're here, everyone is very nice. And, we haven't brought down the property values. Everyone's really nice to us, actually, and happy to have us in the neighborhood. But it's that perception and fear that any person of color is going to mess up your neighborhood. It's really the same kind of thinking that somebody explained in their presentation, our former president was using. The idea that anybody's going to be around you is going to be bad for the sanctity of your suburban neighborhood and your costs and your ability to do things. And, the reality is that's increasingly less true. And in many cases, it's just false. But that has been a huge barrier to getting around systemic racism in housing.
Great. I'm sorry that we haven't had much questions yet. Thanks for that one chat. Jillian, any others we want to jump in on?
So it looks like we are actually almost out of time. We have 2 minutes left. I want to be kind of respectful of everybody's time. Thank you for all the great questions, though. We did have 2 hand raises. I know Alex has had their hand up for a while, so maybe we can just do Alex and then wrap up. Does that work?
That'll be great. And then some follow-up, any final comments? Yes, if we have time.
Perfect.
Thank
All right, Alex, I'm going to mute you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for allowing me to speak. My question is for Attorney Hill. You mentioned that that there are two goals of the Fair Housing Act. I can't articulate the wording of the second goal, but it's governments need to go back and make things right, so to speak. How does that look? What does that look like in your eyes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I saw it in the chat. Okay, now let me just say that there are whole books written about this, again, The Color of Law, and whole classes and everything else. But the short answer is that what that looks like is working to identify barriers to open housing choice in communities, taking an honest, clear-eyed look based on the experience of community members who experience oppression, right? Believing people when they tell you what has happened to them, also looking at the ways in which zoning policies and land use policies and state laws and city ordinances impact people's access to housing choice, and then working to change those systems that keep people trapped in cycles of poverty or in communities that they, if they had an actual choice, would choose to leave, right? And so the way we do that, there are several processes that are actually in place. In 2015, the Obama administration released a rule through HUD, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. And again, there have been books written about this and whole classes taught, but the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule excuse me, actually clarifies the role that local governments need to take in creating these open and inclusive communities. And it requires that local governments, in order to continue getting their HUD funding, actually go through a planning process called the Assessment of Fair Housing. In New Orleans in 2016, we were actually the first jurisdiction in the country to submit one of these assessment fair housing plans. The Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center and other folks that I'm sure are on this call were a part of that process, and the city of New Orleans submitted that plan, which was accepted and approved by the Obama administration HUD office. And then that rule was rescinded under HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who worked under the Trump administration. And the hope amongst fair housing advocates is that the Biden administration will republish that rule, and that local governments will again be responsible for going through that planning process. So that's kind of the short answer. There are many ways to get to that point, but again, the goal has to be about redressing and actually working to correct barriers to housing choice in our communities.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Can I just mention one book that has not been mentioned, and that's all I want to say is one additional book. The Color of Law got a lot of, which is great, but there's also a book called When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Casselson. And I think it is one of the most important books that people could read, because what it shows is the history, much of the history that we talked about on this panel, of the ways in which the federal government gave specific money, subsidies, and advantages to whites in the areas of housing, education, and other areas that have structured why things are the way they are, who lives in the suburbs and who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a really important book, When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Casselson.
Thank you for that.
And Professor Crusto, we did have a question to wrap up for everyone, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So, and panelists, like if you have any time to answer any of these questions in the chat or in the Q&A, we do still have a lot left. People really value your opinion. So if you have the time, please feel free to do so. But Ben asked, if you could create any law or policy to fix the problems that you are describing, what would you do? Imagine that you are the dictator and can pass absolutely any law you want without regard to how anyone feels about it.
Let's start with Professor Rausa. This will be a good way to wrap up.
I haven't written about this. It's not even my topic for today. My main one is we should recognize the human right to housing, which is Lisa has written about. That'd be my starting on this point, but we're not there. But if I get unlimited route, I think I would go with that.
Okay, thank you. Lisa?
That was really good. So I'm with Ezra on that one, Professor Rosser on that one. I think the other thing is that we really have an opportunity with what the Biden administration is trying to have Congress and others do with correcting issues in light of the coronavirus. And we have a real opportunity to direct the amount of money needed to really create opportunities for people in housing. And so I would say that those spending bills need to be big and they need to be directing resources to resolving this problem. The failure to put money behind these things is one of the things that's really caused a problem.
Okay. Attorney Hill, Professor Hill.
And if I were a dictator and could do anything to sort of get us to this goal, it would be just wiping away white supremacy. That's the real goal, right, in my mind. And I shared something in the chat that that Bill Quigley shared with me, which is a resource that lays out 27 ways in which racism and white supremacy impact housing. And I think it's something that it would behoove, everybody who's a part of this conversation to be very clear about how we got here and why we're here. And so that would be my wish if I had my choice.
Great. Well, thank you for everyone on this presentation. If I had my wish, I guess I would give everyone a $100,000 housing voucher so they can go into the marketplace and do whatever they need to do with that money. How's that for a political statement? Well, thanks again. Of course, this is only the first session of many wonderful Today sessions on various aspects of systemic structural racism. Housing is very, very important. It's important for all Americans, in particular for less advantaged and racially discriminated against individuals. We thank you for your conversation and being with us. We hope you stick around for the second panel, which is on education. In the meanwhile, we're all available, at least I'm available by email. You know where to find me here at Loyola. Thanks again for our presenters. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the future.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Crusto, for moderating this panel. Thank you to Brian Huddleston for the tech assistance with this, making this Zoom run smoothly so far. And I think we're going to take a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, get some water, and then we will reconvene then.